Renderman 22 and shaders, and mainly the pxrSurface shader is today's topic. It's gonna be a lengthy episode. I'm gonna leave some timestamps in the comments below so you can jump to whatever section you want. If you're new here to my channel, consider subscribing and hit the bell notification so you don't miss anything. Let's jump into it now. Shaders here in Renderman. So we have a few ways to apply shaders. So one way is to use this tab up here. So you select the object and you can right click and say pxrSurface, Pixar layered surface, and you have also Meshmen hair, so that's a hair shader. Disney, that's the old legacy Disney shader that's been in there for a while. Constant and displays. And also, if I now switch over to Hypershade, I have a Hypershade shading tab here. So in my Hypershade view, I actually took away the create dialog there. So what you can do is you can either just type, or you can right click and say create node and you spawn this one. This is non-standard, it's just me docking stuff together. Anyway, under the Renderman section, you have shaders here. You have the main. This one is usually docked here. So we have the same shaders here in the Hypershade and the legacy one, the same here. But when I create here, I usually just type. So if I know that I want to apply a pxrSurface, I can just tab and start to say pxr and s. And go down on surface, and there we go, that get pxrSurface. So I can just apply it here, assign material to viewport, and that's another way to apply it. So yeah, that's different ways to create shaders. So now let's dive into some of the basics for and the common settings for the pxrSurface. Okay, so before we dive into actual looking at each and every component of the shader, there's a few settings that I can just talk about. That's general. If we look at one of the, like the diffuse here, under advanced we have bump, and this is something that's gonna be on all of the different lobes here, so the specular lobe. Also have this under advanced, so you can either add bumps as a global thing, and you do that on a global here, then it's gonna bump everything you add to it, or you can do it on a per lobe basics. That's kind of like the general thing. And there's also a few settings that you can choose on per lobe basis. For example, you can choose on the specular, it's gonna cover that more, but you can switch between different appearances of specular, and that's going to be something that's going to be general for all of the specular settings. But now let's dive into the diffuse component. I'm expanding here the diffuse drop down here, so we have the advanced and the main one. So the gain is just the strength. So you want to map this. If you have a wet object, you can diminish the gain here, or actually also if you have a metallic object, you will take this down to 0 and set up the specular. So that's the use of the gain, and the color is obviously the color of the object. So if you make it red, it's gonna look red. We have the roughness slider. So by default it's set to 0, and then this lobe here is gonna act as a Lambert. If you set it to 1, it's gonna act as an Ornayars. And you see here, if you set it to something above 0, you see that this exponent just disappears. So that's because you can't set the exponent if you have something towards Ornayar. So yeah, so the exponent is, if we set this to something high here, you see that it starts to look different. So this is a setting that you can play with. It's kind of interesting that look. Okay, so I wanna explore the bump now here on the diffuse. So I expanded here and I see everything. So I wanna hook the bump normal here under the diffuse bump normal. So let's take this one. So we wanna bump the normals there, and let's make a Pixar whirly or something interesting, and hook this up to input bump there. There we see. So now we have a bump diffuse component here. So what happens if I would now add a specular on this one? Just let's take primary specular and set it to something. So you see it doesn't respect the bump, so it only bumps the diffuse. So if you want to use something like a bump on everything, you have to hook it up to the globals down here instead. It's gonna bump everything. Sometimes you just want to bump the specular or the diffuse, so that's a good option to have. But yeah, that's just a side note how to bump just one component. I want to take a look at the final setting here under the diffuse here. So we have this double-sided. So if I enable that, we get another set of settings here as a drop-down. We can, for example, we can set, if I make this green here and transmit color and up this, it's gonna act more like a transmission, almost like some kind of fake subsurface or a backlit. So that's another. You can check this and say override it again here with the back color. I guess you can fake leaves and stuff like that. So let's dive into specular. So this is the section. So we have the primary specular and advanced. So the specular is going to be similar on both the primary and the rough specular when it comes to the actual settings, but you can add. It's just that the rough specular has a roughness set to 0.6 as default, so you can have 2 specular lobes. That's good for mimicking skin, I guess. Has both qualities, so like a rough and sometimes a more sharp one. The first we see here is it defaults to artistic mode. So we have a specular Fresnel mode, artistic and physical. So artistic, you're gonna drive it with these 2 sliders here. For example, if I want to do something that's plastic material, I have less face color and more edge. You get this kind of fall off there. And then we also have the Fresnel exponent here. So this is the fall off between, I guess, the face and the edge and the roughness. Set it to 0, it's going to behave more like a mirror. To 1, it's going to act as a diffuse. So that's the settings. We also have this under the same goes here for, you know, connecting a bump. Let's actually connect the bump to my material here. Let's take, nothing happens. It was disabled, my fault. Let's increase this to something. We can see it more in action. You can see it starts to break up the spec there. We can actually add it to the bump as well, to the diffuse. There you go. Now we should have the same bump for both diffuse and specular. Okay, I just want to see the actual response here. Specular model, Beckman. So this is the documentation said Beckman is more for mirror type objects, and if you want to have when roughness is involved, if you have roughness, you can set this to GGX. I like the GGX better because it has like a tail on the roughness. Let's actually create a sphere here. I think it's more obvious and actually make this a like a chrome ball. So here we see Beckman. So I've increased the roughness here, you see, and if I set this to GGX, there's a little more bloom happening. So I think this is a little more photographic. See the difference between when you converge a bit there. GGX, Beckman has a tighter spec. So yeah, I usually set this to GGX when I have something with roughness. It's way nicer. surface response, in my opinion. Anisotropic, you can see here now it starts to shift it that way, and if I go minus, it's gonna be this way there. So now we have only bumped the specular component of this one, so the diffuse is actually not bumped down considerably here. I don't have any diffuse component, to be honest, so let's remedy that. Now we can see the specular is only bumped. So that's the basic of specular in artistic mode. But there's this other mode here as well, so let's take the bump away and switch this over to art physical. So now we get another set of, let's go back and forward here, we can see physical adds extinction coefficient and refraction index and edge color. So edge color is left from, that's this one, gets shuffle up, we get refraction index and extinction coefficient. So what you do, this one you usually drive with like real world measurements. So you go to a refraction index database and look up, well, what's the refraction index and extinction coefficient of this material, for example. To demonstrate that, we can actually go here to material preset browser here and just say, okay, I want to assign gold onto this guy. So here we have, so this one I know is set up with physical mode, and here you see the properties it has from the presets. We have edge color, and refraction index is set to 1.4 and it has a tint here. So if I start to mess with the tint, you see what happens. So gold, you don't set, when it's physical, you don't set the color directly. The opposite color of blue in the spectrum is yellow. It absorbs blue, so therefore it leaves yellow. I guess that's how it actually works in real life. Extinction coefficient in this one is set to this. So it's 3.9 in value, so that's the IOR, I guess. Saturation and the actual, the edge color, I mean. You will probably look into databases, IOR and the surface properties when you set it to physical. Otherwise you can drive it through artistic, that's more like painting real world. So I want something like, if you want to do something gold in the artistic, you will probably want to set this to the color that's gonna be instead of the actual color. Let's see, let's take something and mess with the Fresnel. That's not gold, but you get the drift. The rough specular is mimicking what you have in the primary specular, but it has a rougher preset. So we can demonstrate this by, so you see now we have two specular lobes. We have one specular lobe that's not tinted, but it also has the same settings as for Beckman, GGX, etc. Yeah, okay, so that's something about the specular components here in the pxrSurface shader. So next, let's get into the clear coat. Clear coat is a way to add like a varnish type effect. You can see this on cars, objects that has been lacquered with like a see-through clear coat. So we have the artistic and the physical mode. Artistic is gonna have the same properties as the specular. The physical is gonna have edge color and refraction index, and then you get a second like layer thickness, absorption, tint, and so that's something we can play with. But let's start with the artistic. Artistic here, if I set it up, see that we get a surface response here. In a sense, it's like a third specular. However, the clear coat is not meant to have a very high roughness. You can overdrive it, but in real world objects, a clear coat is very sharp. So it's more about layering on top of already pre-existing specular. Let's make this metallic effect here, so we can take away some of the gain here. And then we add clear coat on top. So now we have a rough base reflection, and then we have something that's on top of it, like a lacquer type of effect. This is traditionally the way you use clear coat. You might map it as well, so you have areas with where it's clear coat and not. You have a Fresnel component there as well, so it's going to be waiting between those two there. And the roughness, I guess it doesn't really make sense to increase the roughness on the clear coat. That kind of defies the purpose of it. You obviously want something with another roughness than the underlying roughnesses, otherwise it's going to be like adding one over the other. You also here have energy compensation. So what this does, I think it's, if you have clear coat, it's gonna remove some of the specular to compensate for the clear coat. You also have the ability to add bump to the clear coat. So let's try to just bump the clear coat here and see what happens. There we have the bump. So let's take result normal to the bump on our clear coat. Let's overcrank this. Let's remove this. Also, we have the artistic mode, and this one will bring another set of settings to the mix. For example, let's take this down. So the IOR is gonna be how you control the fall off on this guy. So I guess you don't want under 0, that's gonna be, so above 1, at 1 you don't gonna see anything. It's gonna be like turning it off. I guess it's gonna be the same, but going above it you will see that it's gonna be more and more coming through there. This is one way, but what's interesting is the absorption tint here. For example, if I start to add like a red or something, nothing happens here. If I start to increase the thickness, this one, so I guess we have to make the underlying specular component. You're gonna see the thicker you do it, it's gonna be like a thicker varnish. You're gonna get deeper values here, and that's pretty cool. Because this is something you can see on cars. You can see like a very thick with a slight tint in the clear coat is gonna be acting more like a physical clear coat. Here example, if you want something, if you go fully, you don't want a clear color, you want something with less saturation in it. And then the thickness slider here is gonna be like everything below here, pretty you know, like overexposed here because I cranked up the diffuse and my reflectivity here to get something. For example, a chrome paint has like a kind of a diffuse undercoating, and then the clear coat is gonna knock it down, and then you get this kind of deep effect. And this is gonna, when the object moves, this is gonna be even more evident. So that's more like a car paint approach. Absorption tint, you have to play with that one as well. But yeah, this gives another type of effect, and it can be really cool on objects. That's something about the different clear coat effects. So next up, I guess it's gonna be the iridescence. Okay, so iridescence is a effect like soap bubbles. Beetlebacks is something that usually have iridescence, or like your Blu-ray player you can see on discs, you can kind of see kind of iridescence type of effect. Let's take this down and just look at it in isolation. So if I start to increase the phase and edge gain, you will see here the effect. We can play with the colors here, for example, and see what happens. You can see now we have this. The Fresnel is gonna be how it's weighted. The fall off, this is what is set to by default, so we can, let's take some high numbers and see what happens. We can flip the direction, hue direction. So yeah, this one calls for some playing around here to see the effect. So this one is kind of can get some holistic effects there, and you can obviously play with your colors here. The physical mode, the thin film thickness. You don't have any ways to choose the color here in this physical mode. I guess it's based upon physical. So Let's take something high here, 1000. That almost looks like you will see around when you have weld seams, you almost get these kind of colors when you... Let's take something 5000 and see what happens. That's different effects, and you will probably apply it on in conjunction with clear coat and other effects. So some specular underneath, a bit of diffuse. Here we have something like a kind of cool effect going on. So yeah, that's something about the clear coat. So let's get into the fuzz next. Okay, so fuzz, it's one of those things you don't use that often, but it can come in handy. So it's based upon actually fur shading. The lobe behaves something like more like a Marshner hair type effect. So it's meant to simulate velvety type of surfaces and peach fuzz, I guess, and stuff like that, and without actually having fur. You can also use it as like almost like a dust layer. So if you want to make something that this like it's been a little bit dust covering it, so let's create something with dust color here, like some kind of warm, and just increase the gain here, and not so much happens. And then we have to start to play here with the cone angle, so we can start to see if I increase this, you can see it start to happen here on the glazing angles, like it's almost like a fine powder covering, and it's wrapping the light a bit. So I think it introduced a diffuse into the mix here on top of everything there, and that's kind of how I use fuzz on and off. So yeah, that's kind of fuzz in a nutshell. Yeah, so let's get into the subsurface component next. So, subsurface scattering. This is gonna be a brief rundown, because subsurface scattering really needs its own chapter almost, because there are so many settings in the subsurface shader. Let's apply pxrSurface so we get everything out of the box. So I guess the easiest way is to just chuck a light behind here. So one thing, subsurface scattering is one of those effects that really needs physical measurements. So in my case, so this garden statue that I retopoed is actually a photo scan, and I went out and measured it. So my conclusion was it's 70 centimeter tall, so I scale it up to 70 centimeters, so it should match the one that's out in the garden. And yeah, so I have a rec light here, and it's in the correct size here, and here we have it. At the moment it's just out of the box. So let's see what happens if we enable subsurface on this guy. First off, unit length here. If you have it in centimeters, so everything in subsurface is, if we look at it, mean 3 path here, for example, this is the distance it will travel into the media. Everything in the subsurface shader assumes that it's in millimeters, so therefore mine is in centimeters, so this unit length here is correct by default now because it's scaled up. So let's apply subsurface, Jensen dipole, all these funky names, Ideon, better dipole, who come up with this, Burley normalized, multi-mean, free path, exponential path race. This one is the new additions that's supposed to be the most correct. I think the better dipole is supposed to be like for jelly type of thing. So I guess if we go to here, go to the section here and read on, because there's so many things here. I'm gonna come back with a tutorial about subsurface on its own when I do a like an organic character. Let's play around here with some of the settings. So first off, we can just enable the gain here and see what happens, and not so much happens because my object is fairly big here actually. You see here the mean free path distance. It's not that much. Let's say 50, or now we start to get something into the object here. We can see it gets, let's try 100, see what happens. We get even more bleeding through the object here. Let's mess with the color here and see what happens, and we can start to play with this color as well. Now we get something. And then let's see, dipole, and there's a lot of settings on these ones. Burly normalized, let's set it back to something like 50. So multi-mean free path, this one is a bit different. So this one it's more artistic. So you have a short color, you have different distances long. What will happen if I set short gain? If I enable the short gain here, for example, set it to something, and then we have the long gain, set that to 0.5 as well. We're gonna see. This is the long distance. It's gonna pick up this color. The short distance is this distance, the 5 here. So like 5 units in, I guess it's gonna favor this color that you have here. So we can map it to something. Let's map it to green. It's gonna have the shorter distance gonna go towards green here, and the long distance, when it goes 20 units in, is gonna bleed out to the red there. You can play with the distance, I guess. If you set the shorter distance here, it's gonna be less of this. It's gonna be more like the near the surface stuff there. Let's set this to 50. It's gonna look like a gummy bear. So this one, I think in the documentation it said this is not physically correct at all, but it's when you have something that you want to achieve, this might be one of those subsurface algorithm that gets you more flexibility when you want to map something very specific. Exponential path trace. This is the new, I think these two are the new ones, and I haven't really played around with those as much as I would like. So we have directionality and diffuse blend here. If I set it to 1, it's gonna favor towards us. Let's see what happens. I think I have to tweak the, I have to increase it. Let's set 100, see what happens. The distance between those there is, let's say 150. Let's see what happens. Let it converge there a bit. So this one I have to familiarize myself with a bit, because this one was introduced, I think, in 21 series, and I haven't really played with it that much. But yeah, I'm gonna come back with a more just subsurface section when I do my next character for the channel. Let's see if we can make this into a gummy bear. Yeah, it definitely needs some playing around with this. Let's enable the HDR here as well. Take down the intensity of this rec light here. It's kind of a soft statue now. Almost looks like it's made out of some kind of rubber. This diffuse blend here. So this one is bringing back some of the diffuse into the mix. Okay, so let's let it converge here on this setting, and yeah, I'm gonna come back with a more like a creature tutorial later on, where I'm actually gonna dive into this subsurface. There is so many settings, and to be honest, I haven't played with the new subsurface, so I don't feel comfortable enough to go through everything with this new subsurface mode, especially the later one here. Single scatter is similar to you know, effects like leaves and stuff like that, and traditionally single scatter was used with subsurface to help it a bit. Not sure if we need it that much anymore now. with all of the new subsurface modes we have to our disposal. It's nested in here under the scattering. So next now, let's dive into the glass. Okay, so glass settings now on this guy. So first off, if I just enable glass on this by going into the glass section and take a look here. Let's collapse all of the other stuff here. Refraction and reflection. Bump this up and yeah, let's take down the diffuse. So now we should have glass, but it looks very strange, and that's because on the dome light we have to enable visible in refractions. And now it looks like glass. I'm just gonna quickly check what's integrator I'm rendering with. Path tracer, that's fine. Okay, so going back here to the material, take a look here at my glass components. So refraction color, that's gonna tint the refraction towards something. Let's make it greenish. So this is a way to create something similar to like a green bottle or something. However, it's gonna be the same. It doesn't behave more like physical. Like if you would have a thicker glass, it would be more absorbent than other. So if you wanna do that, you have to use extinction here. Let's set this back to 0 or to white there, so we get a pure refraction. The roughness is gonna be the roughness, so if we set it up here, it's gonna be more like a frosted glass type of effect. Pure. Advanced here, so we have anisotropy. You have to have some kind of roughness to get that to work. You can see that something happens there. Now it's going this way, smudge it this way. Shading, tangent, but refractive index, set this to 1. It's gonna be like ghost in the shell here. 1.5 I guess is glass. 133 water. Upwards towards diamond. Let's set this back to 1.5. Extinction here. This is I guess what you want to play with. You want to make like something that's more like a glass bottle or something that has actually set up saturation and tweak this. And out of the bat we see that I tweak it towards green, and yeah, I get something else. It gets like some kind of purple color. That's because the opposite of green would be red. That's 100, that's a complementary color from green. It's 180 degree on the color spectrum. You see here, it's gonna be pick up this color. So if you want, for example, if you want the green, you wanna set it to something like that towards red. It can absorb red, so therefore it's gonna leave more green left here. So, and this is how much it's gonna absorb of the color. So the more you set it towards that color, it's gonna go darker, and that's more correct. This is what's how a real glass object would react. Let's set up the roughness a bit so we get something that's more. This to me looks better than tinting the refraction color. See, there's a lot of volume here. You can see that it goes towards darker. There's more medium in this to go through here. If we take this off and set this to green here, it's gonna be a bit different. I want the extinction. That's, to me, that's more pleasing. Scattering albedo for simulating like particles in a volume. So I haven't had the really luck with this. I've been trying to see something, so I have to come back with that one. I think you have to turn on single scattering. Let's see if I can get this to work, but let's turn on multi-scattering, tweak this. But yeah, I have a hard time to see that what is really happening on this interior scattering albedo parameter. So yeah, I'll see. I have to come back to this one. That's the basics of the glass. Let's get into the final steps now in the next chapter, and that's gonna be glow. Okay, so glow, the parameter glow, you shouldn't use it really to make something glow in the sense of a light, because you have other ways to do that. For example, you can convert it into a mesh light with this button here. That's more bang for the buck. However, glow in the dark, like decals or stuff like that, you might want to add something as a surface glow onto the object. We'll probably drive it with some kind of mask, make some kind of Tron like lights or something that's not really illuminating that much. For example, lights on a spaceship or something in the distance that you just want to, like the impression of light without actually lighting the whole thing with millions of lights. You can map something to the object. So yeah, set this to, and this is the color of the light. So if I actually disable this and create polygon plane, scale it up, you will see that it's actually illuminating, but this one will be very noisy. I wouldn't recommend using this method to anyone to light anything, because yeah, it's gonna produce a lot of noise. It's better to actually then convert this into a mesh light. Yeah, I did that in previous chapter, link in the description up now. Let's just hook a pattern to it so we can see. You see now we have a checker where the light is gonna, the white is gonna emit. There you see the actual color. So let's set this to green. Yeah, imagine you have a black and white mask different, where it's white is gonna be whatever color you set here. So yeah, that's a way, but yeah, don't use it as a light per se. So let's take a look at some of the like the global settings, and I guess we're gonna wrap this after that. Some of the global settings, let's do it this way. So we have this bump here, and it's in previous chapters I hooked it up directly to different lobes, or like the diffuse on its own or spec on its own. In this case we can hook it up down here to the bump here, and it's gonna bump everything that I make to it. So let's do that, result bump, and looking at this now, it's connected there, and we have something here going on, the pattern here. So now it's bumping everything. If I now add, for example, my specular, it's gonna bump the specular as well, because it's hooked up into the global slope there. Clear code, let's do something physical. Let's set absorption to something, increase the thickness, make this reflective, all of the things we've done before. Pump up the roughness a bit. Let's actually make something like golden, and we'll see we have bump there. Let's tune this down, take away clear coat. Now we have only diffuse. Actually, let's take down the gain here and increase my glass to see what happens. And we also have a bump on the glass. So yeah, it's a global thing on that one, as we can see. Shadow color, I guess you always wanted black, but if you want to do something real crazy, you can set it to something else. And yeah, don't do this. It's not gonna render properly, because you're breaking laws of physics, but sometimes that's what's required. But if you want something that's physical, this should be black always. Presence, this is you can map like opacity. You see, if I do something here, it just goes below 1 here, turns off, and that's because cached. Non-cached, you can see you can start to tweak this. So this one is an addition in 22. You can actually tweak the opacity much better on the shader. So this was hard to do before. You either had it on and off, so it didn't play with the values between 0 and 1, really great. So that's something we can do now. Okay, so I guess that's it for all of the parameters and lobes and everything on the Pixar surface shader. So I guess the next time I'm gonna come back and look at the Pixar layered one. It's gonna be a lot of the settings here is gonna be the same for that one, so I'm not gonna go through. I'm just gonna do like a layered shader next time and set that up, because that's gonna build upon my tutorial about look deving this Gatling gun that I textured in Mario later on. So I'm gonna use layered shader there. So we're getting towards that, and yeah, see you on the channel. You made it to the end. That's awesome. But if you wanna stay up to date and you haven't subscribed before, so consider subscribing now and hit the bell notification so you don't miss anything. And yeah, see you on the channel.